Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Sean Fraser, the Federal Chief Security Officer at Okta. Sean, good to have you back.
Thanks for having me. Always good to see you, Tom.
And modernization is on the lips of everybody in the Defense Department these days. Digital transformation, modernization, whatever you want to call it. It's a lot of things. What do you see as the biggest challenge the components and the Pentagon face as they attempt to modernize?
So I think some of the biggest things tend to be kind of the basic building blocks and being able to kind of fundamentally modernize some of the things that we've done and kind of taken for granted over the last 20, 25 years. So I see, and a lot of it is driven by the environment that we all find ourselves in, right? So you think about kind of any enterprise in the world has been dealing with kind of extreme telework situations. A lot of people working from home. We're starting to get back to work now, but now we still need to think about how do we move to a dynamic workforce where we can still enable the enterprise users to access, things from anywhere at any time. So I think that, being able to build identity constructs, being able to build security around those constructs is super important. And I think one of the challenges is that we've been doing this for so long. We have so much legacy. We have so many things we need to go revisit and relook at in the, through the lens of today and the dynamic world we find ourselves in.
All right. And you mentioned identity, and this is also a big issue for a lot of agencies because there's a lot that has to happen for a good identity management system, including privacy, including accuracy, including one identity per person and not multiple. It goes on and on. So, in the DoD context, what role do you think the ICAM plays in modernization? Sounds central to it.
It's actually the most important thing. I always like to tell people nothing really happens until somebody or something asks for access to something. So that's always an identity conversation. Being able to prove that the person asking for access to the data is really that person, making sure without a shadow of a doubt that their security is there from that connective tissue from the user to the application serving up that data. So it's probably the most important conversation. The first thing that people look at when they start thinking about is zero trust architecture is how do I provide that user accessibility while also maintaining that security protection. So security, identity, and access management is important. Security and identity proofing is important. Again, proving it's the right user, and then continuously validating that user as they come in. So if they come in from different places, which they will, we're all kind of traveling, we all move around, we're a pretty mobile workforce. Being able to continuously validate the trustability of that request. And these are all core to kind of zero trust principles.
I was going to say, there must be an architecture to ID behind all of this because let's look at the world situation, for example. You could have someone in DoD that's been stationed in Ramstein or somewhere, and all of a sudden they're deployed just on alert in Poland, a couple thousand miles away. And yet it's the same person. They might be using a remote device instead of a desktop from where they came from or a mobile device. And so, yet the ID has to still be there with them and it has to live somewhere and the verification has to live somewhere. Maybe talk about that idea.
Yeah, and it's mostly around context. So it's not just the user. So you talk about location. Location is a piece of context. You talk about the device. Maybe it's a mobile device. Maybe it's a laptop, which still kind of a mobile device. So it's the context of those devices. So what does the device profile look like from a security perspective? Can I take that into account as I allow this user or don't allow this user to come in? And being able to do that at wire speed. So when the user kind of does it, it just transparently happens and the user doesn't get blocked or stopped or anything. It just sails right through, provided that the user is who they say they are, coming from the right device, from the right location. All those things kind of check off and you get all green check marks. If anything happens untoward during the process of that conversation or that communication, then we can start adding friction to it. So it's a balance between user experience and adding friction only when it's warranted.
And one way to make sure that people are who they are is, and this is nothing new, but the idea of biometrics. But lately, there's been some friction on facial with several federal agencies just because of the privacy concerns and so forth. So, what do you see as the best possible going forward authentication methods to go with the whole ICAM stream?
So I think the good news is that we've seen this done at scale in the commercial world for the last several years. I always point to kind of Apple's philosophy in the way they use Touch ID and Face ID, where they're not really kind of storing the face, they're really kind of storing attributes that equate to the face, and then they do authentication based upon that. I think that we continue to need to think about biometrics as being important, because certainly that's one way to proof a user is someone takes a selfie, they look at the face and they determine that that's the real person. But we always have to take privacy into account. Security and privacy are two sides of the same coin. So they're always kind of intermingled. So we shouldn't do things like store that face in a database somewhere forever. It's something where we should use it, forget it, delete it, and give the user options to kind of opt out of things from a privacy perspective. We have to always thinking about those levers because it's a constant balance.
Yeah, so you have to really be careful about using third-party holders of this type of information, maybe relegate them, not relegate, but use them for some kind of a verification of context, but not actually the ID itself.
Yeah, and that's super important as we move forward and think about, well, who has your data, right? Because it's one thing that as consumers, we don't necessarily think about. Everything looks kind of peachy from the end user perspective on a mobile device. We don't always think about who's hosting that data, where they're hosting it, their trustability of that entity. It's one of the reasons why we think really, really hard about kind of where we sit in the FedRAMP world as we kind of work with the enterprise. One of the reasons why Okta is working for higher assurance levels with FedRAMP High. We're working with DoD IL4 because we want agencies and folks to be able to trust us with their data, trust us with those transactions. And in order to do that, that's a really good mechanism to validate that we're doing exactly what we say we do.
And with respect to FedRAMP, of course, that applies to cloud hosted solutions, and that's pretty much what DoD and everyone else are going after. But for those austere environments where a lot of the resources are taken in an unconnected manner, is it possible to replicate those ICAM requirements in a unconnected or austere environment when, for at least temporarily, you may not have time for that, or you may not have the ability to reach back to a cloud?
It is, but it's always a lot harder when you have to build everything yourself. It's one of the reasons why kind of cloud and modernization go hand in hand, because it's a lot easier and it's a more agile environment to modernize if you can do it in a cloud environment, because that way you're putting the trust in being agile into companies like Okta, where we do this for a living. We update servers, we patch things, we make sure things are secure. We're always, full on feature velocity. So we're adding new features as new technologies are released by some of the service providers like Apple and Google and others. We're building those into our platform. It's a lot harder if you're custom building that. So I always encourage that agencies and specifically mission partners look at this, is that look at kind of the biggest nut you want to crack as being the most modern, the most agile environment. You're always going to have kind of the disconnected use cases, the more secure use cases, but that is going to be a smaller environment in some cases, in which case you can focus more of your effort on securing those environments, because it's going to take a lot more, and then outsource some of the things to the cloud service providers for things that we do really, really well.
And Sean, we should talk about zero trust. We now have the latest memo from the Office of Management and Budget fleshing out the idea from the executive order of last May, in effect, ordering agencies to get good with zero trust architectures. How can DoD get there? What are some of its challenges?
So the good news is that a lot of the things in that memo came from the good work happening at DoD, happening in other agencies. So the DoD has been looking at zero trust for the last several years as being kind of the security answer to the modernization journey that they're on. And the memo 2209 builds on that. It builds on that guidance from DoD. It builds on some of the guidance from NSA. It builds on the maturity model from CISA. So all these agencies are working together and collaborating on what guidance can be useful for agencies to go out and basically figure out the how of zero trust. We've been talking about the what of zero trust for 5 or 6 years. Now we need to focus on the how.
All right. And so is this something doable within resources they have, do you think?
Yeah, and there's a lot of other pieces, ancillary pieces to this. If you think back to last year with the executive order that came out talking about software bill of materials, which is supply chain things, and how that kind of works tangentially with zero trust and the new guidance coming out. The important thing to focus on is that this shouldn't be a net new effort. Most organizations should, kind of stand up a tiger team, stand up a group that looks at their environment to see where they're already a little zero trusty. They might have good identity and access management. They might be leveraging multi-factor authentication. They might be leveraging phishing-proof factors, which is what called out specifically in 2209. So if they're doing some of these things, or at least working towards some of those things, they're already on the path to zero trust. So don't think of it as I'm starting from zero. Think of it as I'm starting from somewhere. And it's a journey that never ends. This is a lifestyle choice where you will change the way you think about security philosophically and bake it into your environment.
Sean Fraser is Federal Chief Security Officer at Okta. Great having you with us.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio for more of the DoD Cloud Exchange.